Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Untangling the Impact of Illegal Fishing in North Korean Waters. I'm Pam Kennedy, a research analyst with Stimson's East Asia program, and I will be moderating today. Before we begin, a quick housekeeping note. You'll see a Q&A chat function in your window. Please post your questions there at any time during the webinar, and after our speakers have made their initial remarks, I will draw from your questions for the Q&A. We are recording this webinar and you will be able to find it later on in the Stimson website. To provide some context for our discussion today, among the sanctions that the UN Security Council imposed on North Korea in 2017 are sanctions banning North Korea from transactions related to fishing and seafood, not only the export of these goods, but also the sale of fishing rights to foreign companies. Despite the Security Council sanctions and China's own bans on these activities, numerous Chinese vessels have been identified by satellite as operating in North Korea's exclusive economic zone. So today we will discuss the intersection of political, economic, and environmental activities on this particular issue, how North Korea tries to circumvent sanctions, the influx of Chinese flagged vessels into North Korean waters, the efforts of North Korean fishers to find new areas to fish, hence the related North Korean ghost ships that you might have heard of, and the impact of distant water fishing and overfishing on the sustainability of fisheries and the environmental security of North Korean as well as regional coastal communities. These complex entangled issues occur within a global problem of illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU, fishing by distant water fleets. And it's difficult to assess the magnitude of the problem without rigorous monitoring of fishing activity collected by individual countries, which is not always made public. But we do have new insight into the illegal fishing by Chinese vessels in North Korea's waters, thanks to a new study released in Science Advances this summer, which used satellite technologies to create a clearer picture of the size of illegal fleets and their catches. These insights will help us to better assess both the scale of the problem and the impact on North Korea's fishing industry. So allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Sally Ozell is the director of the Environmental Security Program at the Stimson Center. Her research examines the suite of environmental threats that have the potential to undermine national, regional, or global security. In particular, her work focuses on ocean security, climate security, and wildlife protection. Next, Jae-yoon Park, senior data scientist at Global Fishing Watch, analyzes fishing activities using various satellite data sources and helps identify vessels around the world. He joins us today as one of the authors of the Science Advances study, Illuminating Dark Fishing Fleets in North Korea. Finally, last but not least, Jenny Town is the Deputy Director of Stimson's 38 North, a website that provides policy and technical analysis on North Korea. As an expert on North Korea, she co-founded 38 North to be a source of accurate analysis on North Korea. Sally, would you like to start us off?
Great. Thank you, Pam. Thanks for that great introduction. And thank you, Jenny and Jae-yoon, for this opportunity to speak today on untangling the impact of illegal fishing in North Korean waters. And good morning, everyone, whether it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So as Pam said, I'm the director of the Environmental Security Program, and today we're going to really focus on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or as we call it, IUU fishing, and discuss some of the security concerns, particularly in Asia, and highlight a few key actions to combat that. Next slide, please. So IUU fishing is a global industry. It generates an annual profits of up to about 23 billion a year and makes up 20 to 50% of the global fishing catch. IUU fishing affects most major markets. It's fair to say that most of us joining today on this event have unknowingly consumed IUU fish. So let me first define what we mean by IUU fishing. Illegal. That's pretty straightforward. That's when a vessel circumvents a law or regulation at some level. For example, a foreign vessel fishing in another state's domestic waters or exclusive economic zone without permission. Unreported. Unreported is a little tougher to identify because it often occurs where enforcement is lacking. This accounts for legally flagged vessels who have an agreement to fish in another country's waters, but take far more than their license or agreement allows. For example, the agreement to fish may say be for 5 tons of fish, but they take much more and then they do not report their additional catch. Unregulated. Unregulated is fishing which occurs in areas where there are no laws governing it, and this particularly occurs on the high seas. So today we'll hear in great detail from Jae-yoon about their research, which identified over 800 Chinese fishing vessels illegally fishing in North Korean waters. Chinese vessels. They were operating illegally because, as Pam said, they violated a 2017 UN security resolution, which banned all trade related to North Korean fishing, explicitly including the sale of fishing rights under a longstanding arrangement between China and North Korea. Next slide, please. So, current fishing practices around the world are increasingly unsustainable. Today, it is estimated that roughly 90% of the world's fisheries are either overfished or fished to their biological limit. IUU is linked to distant water fishing across the globe and falls under a very complex and opaque system. There is a lack of information about where vessels operate, who owns them, the amount of fish they catch, how fish is moved along the seafood supply chain, and that includes transshipment at sea or through middlemen on land. And the definition of what constitutes a distant water fleet is debated. For most nations, it includes any fishing vessels that operate in another country's territorial waters or EEZ. China, on the other hand, does not consider their fleets to be engaged in distant water fishing when they fish in a neighboring country's waters. And as most of you know, this is a rather contentious issue. Fishing tensions have been high this summer, whether it's in Ecuador, North Korea, or across the South China Sea, where coastal states have witnessed China's distant water fleets fishing in and around their waters. Now, Chinese vessels have the exact same motivations as most other distant water fishing vessels. At Stimson, we issued a report last November, which found that distant water fleets are motivated by 3 main factors: economics, governance, and access. Economic incentives are the primary driving force. Fishing fleets are driven by where the fish are and how easily and cheaply they can get those fish to market. Fleets are more likely to fish where governance and enforcement capacity is low. Weakened governments have less capacity to monitor activities, making it a lot easier for vessels to engage in IUU fishing and not get caught. And then third, fleets operate where they can get the best access agreement to another country's waters. This can involve preferential treatment for foreign fleets from certain states or quid pro quo deals for investment or infrastructure, which raise concerns about a level playing field between the local fisher folk and the distant water fleets. The Chinese vessels in North Korean waters were motivated by economics, catching large quantities of squid and bringing them to nearby markets. Further, North Korean enforcement capacity, as you can imagine, is quite low, and these vessels had an easy access to North Korean waters despite the UN sanctions. These vessels took advantage of a very opaque condition that is, I noted, across the industry. The UN has been aware that Chinese vessels were fishing in North Korean waters, but the full extent of the operations the high number of vessels was really not known until this new study by Global Fishing Watch, which Jae-yoon will discuss in great detail. So over the last few years, China has started to take numerous steps towards better managing its distant water fishing operations. So for example, they now mandate vessel monitoring systems, or what we call VMS, and automated information systems, or AIS, on their vessels, and they require that they be turned on at all times. They have also blacklisted vessels, denied subsidies to vessels that are caught engaging in illegal fishing. However, as Jae-yoon will explain, the Chinese vessels in North Korean waters turned off their tracking systems going dark, which suggests either nefarious or illegal type activities. They're doing something and they don't want to be caught. Furthermore, it shows a pattern where China is developing these really good rules and regulations on the books, but is either not yet capable or not yet willing to enforce them. Interestingly, North Korea and China have had a rather tenuous relationship around fishing and its related economies servicing fishing vessels. For example, in 2013, North Korea banned Chinese vessels from their waters, only to then turn around and sign an agreement the same year, but one which raised several illegal fishing concerns. And then in 2015, China and North Korea signed an agreement allowing for only 59 Chinese vessels to fish off the east coast of North Korea. Suggesting anything further would be deemed illegal. And if you look, China comes out with an annual yearbook that covers fishing. And if you look at their 2016 yearbook, which actually covers 2015 activities, it said China was only 1/10 of what China's catch in 2015 was only 1/10 of what it had been the previous year. So that means it was 100,000 tons, and then it went down to 17,000 tons. I think it's fair to say that this is really a lack of transparency and consistency in information about Chinese vessels fishing in North Korean waters. And again, I'm sure Jae-yoon will provide us with much more information on that front. Next slide, please. So, IUU fishing and the lack of transparency is really a security threat for several reasons. Its harmful effects on global fishing stocks and ocean ecosystems, which in turn threatens the economic and food security of communities who depend on fisheries for their livelihoods. In North Korea, fishing provides a vital source of income in an economy where the average annual income is estimated to be about $1,300 US back in 2016. Across the world, IU fishing has also been linked to increasing geopolitical tensions, including piracy off the waters of Somalia, narcotic smuggling in Latin America, and tensions throughout Oceania, East and West Africa, and the Asia-Pacific, as vessels compete for dwindling fish in disputed waters. So for example, in the Yellow Sea, there have been clashes between Chinese fishing vessels and South Korean boats. In one instance, back in 2016, a South Korean Coast Guard boat fired at a Chinese fishing vessel suspected of engaging in IUU fishing, and that vessel actually sank the Coast Guard ship. And just last week, tensions flared when the Vietnamese Coast Guard detained one Chinese fishing vessel and chased another in its waters off the northern city of Mong Kai. Chinese fishing companies, it's been interesting, Chinese fishing companies have not tried to hide their illegal engagement in North Korean waters. For example, there is evidence of at least 2 Chinese companies in Hunchun and Ningbo, with government ties, who openly advertised their brokerage of fishing permits from the North Korean government and the Korea's people and the KPA, Korean People's Army. So if we could go to the final slide. So how to combat IUU fishing? Well, clearly the need to combat IUU fishing is through transparency. The lack of transparency across the seafood supply chain really allows IUU fishing, such as the recent events in North Korea. It makes monitoring and enforcement more difficult and increases the problems that I've discussed that are associated with IUU fishing. And Jenny's going to go into more specifics about the UN Security Council and what they can do. But more broadly, governments and international bodies really can take action on a number of fronts. We need to shine a light on all fishing operations and put an end to the secrecy that surrounds this fishing. This is what needs to occur if we're going to reduce IUU fishing. For example, we need a system for global seafood traceability, essentially tracking seafood from where it's caught to when it enters the global market. The European Union and the United States have traceability programs, and Japan is beginning to develop a system too. That would account, if it's fully implemented, to about 60% of the food in the market. Imagine if China signed on and developed one too. Another area for action is global monitoring and capacity building. In the US, we continue to partner with coastal states to share data and information. In fact, our Coast Guard announced a new anti-IUU strategy last week. But these types of efforts can only be sustainable if coastal nations commit to reinvest some of their revenues from the fish access agreements they develop and put them back into their own fisheries management, monitoring, and enforcement. And states need to work with the UN FAO and ratify and implement international agreements like the Port State Measures Agreement, which bars vessels suspected of IUU from offloading illegal catch at port. And then there are various types of information that should be made public. We talked about VMS and AIS tracking systems. And also, we need to have access agreements and ownership vessel information made publicly available. And finally, governments can pass laws. Last year in the United States, Congress passed what we call the Maritime SAFE Act. It was a bipartisan bill which coordinates the US government's response to combat IUU fishing through interagency cooperation. So in closing, let me just remind everyone, IUU fishing robs coastal nations like North Korea of their rightful resources. Transparency across the full seafood supply chain and in all fishing operations is essential if we're going to really end these illegal operations in the global fishing industries. Seafood should not be able to enter any global market without meeting full transparency requirements. And let me end on that, and I look forward to answering questions soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Sally. I'm actually going to post the link to your report, Shining a Light, in the chat box for all the attendees to see. Jae-yoon, could you tell us more about your study?
Right. Thanks, Sally, for this wonderful overview of IUU fishing. So let me share my screen first. I hope you can all see my presentation with red background. Great. So good morning, everyone. And thank you, the Stimson Center and the team for having me today. I'm Jae-yoon Park, Senior Data Scientist and Research Lead for Asia at Global Fishing Watch. Global Fishing Watch works to provide monitoring, control, and surveillance support to governments around the world to assist their efforts in tackling illegal, unreported, unregulated IUU fishing and ensuring fisheries sustainability. Asia is by far the largest fishing region worldwide and has major fishing nations, including China, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, China's Taipei, and Vietnam, with which Global Fishing Watch works closely through various partnerships and seeks to better understand their fishing activities. And it is in this context that we conducted this study of illuminating dark fishing floods in North Korea. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the paper we published in Science Advances 2 months ago, key findings, technologies, some background stories, and what it means to transboundary fisheries management in the region and worldwide. First of all, Global Fishing Watch is an international, independent, and nonprofit organization dedicated to improving ocean sustainability by greater transparency in world fishing. We visualize and track global fishing activity in near real time and for free. And we do this through artificial intelligence and big data analysis. And with our advanced innovative technologies, we assist the governments and countries' efforts to tackle IUU fishing. So I invite you to visit Global Fishing Watch's website, where you can easily navigate a fishing activity map and find data. So let me give you a brief background of how we started this long and difficult journey. In 2018, Global Fishing Watch was seeking a real-world application to test our advanced machine learning techniques and combine our data with other existing satellite imagery. And partners in the region explained that there were a large number of what is often called dark vessels that don't show up in public monitoring systems like AIS, automatic identification systems. Often these vessels are not officially or correctly registered to a country, and their catch goes unverified in any fisheries accounting, making it very difficult to have a comprehensive fisheries management in place. So although local authorities suspected that hundreds of foreign vessels were operating in North Korea, it was challenging to provide this evidence of their fishing activity. And international dialogue around this fishery was on deadlock for years due to lack of transparency. So we immediately realized this could be the test that we were looking for. Could Global Fishing Watch help shine a light on what these vessels were doing in North Korean waters? To set the scene, squid is one of the most loved seafood in the region. South Korea's top seafood by production value, one of the top 5 seafood consumed in Japan, and until recently, the 3rd largest North Korean export. However, it is not only a regional matter. US imports of squid has increased to 80,000 tons in 2018, and the top supplier was China with the lion's share. The reported catches of once abundant species Pacific flying squid have plummeted by about 80%, both in South Korea and in Japan for the past 15 years. And as a small anecdote, in early 2000s, when I visited my aunt in Jumunjin, one of the South Korea's villages known for squid fishing, squid was something that was so common that it was served as a free side dish in all local restaurants. But it is no longer the case anymore. Instead, now it's got a new nickname as golden squid because it's become much rare and 3 to 4 times more expensive than just a few years ago. So the study eliminates extensive illegal fishing in North Korean waters by about 1,000 vessels each year in 2017 and 2018. And it is estimated that they caught roughly the same amount of squid as South Korea and Japan combined, worth about $500 million between 2017 and 18. This is the largest known case of illegal fishing in history, perpetrated by vessels from one nation operating in another nation's waters. We believe this fishing in North Korean waters is illegal. You may ask why. The members of the UN Security Council, including China, unanimously adopted a series of sanctions, resolutions, among others, prohibiting foreign fishing in North Korean waters. We understand any actions contravening these resolutions are in violation of international laws. In addition, the government of China has publicly stated that it did not authorize any flagged vessels to fish in North Korean waters after the resolutions came into force. If the fishing was conducted independently of the Ministry of China, it represents a violation of China's distant water fishing management regulations. Moreover, if the fishing was conducted without permission from the North Korean government, it also represents a violation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Therefore, regardless of scenarios, activity that we detected in North Korean waters represent illegal fishing. In spite of all of this, South Korean Coast Guard continued to observe hundreds of vessels originating from China crossing into North Korean waters. They observed two types of vessels. First, paratrawlers, about 30 to 35 meters long, that drag huge nets between a pair of them and catch indiscriminately everything in their ways. The second, large single lighting vessels, 6 meters long, that use bright light to lure squid to the surface at night. The types of vessels also suggest that they originate from China. Only China has this large number of industrial paratrawlers in the region and has a historic fishing agreement with North Korea, as Sally mentioned. The industrial lighting vessels commonly used by Chinese fishers have unique features such as 4 extendable arms to cast nets and large structures on board to install hundreds of lights, sorry. However, what we were unable to verify through this study was whether these vessels were officially authorized by Chinese authorities. So we used 4 satellite technologies to track the activities of these different types of dark vessels. Each of these satellite technologies provides only a partial picture, but when it is combined, it gives you the whole picture. And it is the first time we combine them all together to publicly expose the activities of dark vessels across multiple years and spanning the national waters. And what is really fascinating about this is that we use machine learning techniques and big data analysis to process such a large amount of data, tens of thousands of high resolution images, and the way that we overlay different data sets to generate new information, opening up new opportunities in the future. Of course, a huge amount of data and expertise of processing or analyzing is contributed to this study by not only the private companies like Planet, but also public institutions and research institutions listed here, representing the importance and the power of collaboration. I'll touch base on the technology very, very briefly, but you can go check our paper, which is open source, and links to the summary articles at the end of the presentation, which is going to be shared to the public. So first, upper left is a high resolution optical imagery, which offers the best visual proof of vessel activity and type. As you can see, there are very distinctive pattern of paratrawling fishing operation. Upper right is a radar imagery, which can identify large metal vessels, here in red, even if heavy clouds are present. Bottom left shows nighttime imaging, which picks up the presence of fishing vessels using lights for squid fishing operation. And fleets use different brightness for their operation, which allows us to distinguish them. Lastly, bottom right is AIS that provides detailed vessel information and tracks, allowing us to trace them back to Chinese ports and their operation in North Korean waters. So combining all of these technologies, we detected about 1,000 vessels yearly operating in North Korean waters despite UN sanctions. And they caught more than 160,000 metric tons of squid worth over $440 million. The study also found about 3,000 North Korean vessels fished illegally in Russian waters. We believe a competition with this large number of industrial vessels of Chinese origin on your right side, likely squeezing these small-scale North Korean fishers out of their own fishing ground on your left. It's a very small, 10 to 20 meters long, and they likely pushing them into neighboring Russian waters. North Korean small wooden primitive boats are severely under-equipped for such long-distance travel, and hundreds of so-called North Korean ghost boats have washed up in Japan in recent years, often found empty or human remains on board. In 2018 only, more than 200 ghost boats were found in Japan, leaving many fishing villages on North Korea's eastern coast as widows' villages. And we found a strong correlation between the number of illegal North Korean fishing vessels operating in Russian waters and the number of ghost boats found on Japanese shores in the past 5 years, representing serious humanitarian consequences of this massive illegal fishing around North Korean waters. All the more reason why we need to embrace transparency at sea and fight IUU fishing. Going forward, we hope the nations in the region respond more proactively to IUU fishing. Global Fishing Watch remains committed to providing monitoring, control, and surveillance support and information to governments to assist their efforts in tackling IUU fishing and ensuring fisheries sustainability. Global Fishing Watch and partners continue to monitor dark fleets in the region through to the end of this year, so that we'll be able to see whether our scientific findings will help make changes on the ground and the policies about transparency of the nations evolve. So we plan to scale this technology up to a global level to help countries around the world eliminate IUU fishing through innovative and science-based solutions. To achieve this ambitious goal of sustainable ocean management, we need more collaboration, we need more data sharing, and we need more innovative solutions, like we demonstrated through this study. This will help us move towards achieving truly sustainable and cooperative fisheries management. So with that note, I'll stop here, and thanks for listening, and over to you, Pam.
Thank you very much, Jae-yoon. That's a great presentation, really interesting. I'm going to post the link to the Science Advances article, as well as the link for sharing your presentation that you sent us earlier, so that folks can take a closer look at it. And Jenny, would you like to tell us more about the political and the sanctions impact for North Korea?
Sure. Thanks, Pam. And I have to say, it's been a real pleasure collaborating across programs at the Stimson Center. We don't do it very often, oddly enough, but I hope we can do more of these collaborations in the future. At this point, Sally and Jae-yoon have covered a lot of ground, so I'll keep my remarks a little bit short, but I decided to first take a little step back and add some context about North Korea's fishing industry first, albeit due to time constraints in somewhat very broad strokes. So in the past, under Kim Jong-il, the fishing industry was largely seen as a very cash cow industry. Efforts were heavily export-oriented, with both the party and military controlling many of the fishing companies and institutions. Under Kim Jong-un, however, the mission of the fishing industry has shifted. While there is still the export earnings motivation, from the beginning of his rule, Kim Jong-un has really begun to stress the need to also increase fish production to solve the food problem, revitalize the fishing sector to improve the dietary lives of the people. This emphasis on fish for domestic consumption has grown over the years to the point where it's been highlighted in Kim Jong-un's New Year's speeches as a key priority sector, especially in 2014, 2015, starting around that era. But this prioritization, however, has led to excessive expansion of fishing and fisheries, which has also led to overfishing to the point, for instance, where North Korea has had to take measures such as designating April and July as fishery resources protection months, although these are not fully enforced or adhered to. So despite this emphasis, though, on fishing and expanded efforts, it has not proven to be an effective way to improve the food supply in North Korea. According to the Korea Maritime Institute in South Korea, for instance, North Korea still lacks the marine product distribution infrastructure, creating real limits on how broadly the fish are distributed out to a wider section of society. So North Korea's fishing industry has other structural problems as well. So if you look at North Korea's estimated fishing fleet, for instance, the Korea Maritime Institute again estimates that North Korea has only 1,500 motorized fishing vessels and somewhere between 4,000 to 9,000 non-powered fishing vessels. They work mainly, as Jae-yoon talked about, in these small size wooden vessels. And this includes even the military-owned fishing vessels are often these small wooden vessels as well. So while Kim Jong-un has emphasized the need to modernize the fishing industry and equipment, the majority of resources needed to do so are hindered by sanctions. This means North Korea's fishing production capability is not fully utilized due to outdated fishing vessels, deteriorated fishing equipment and technologies, a lack of oil and petrol, inadequate fishing gears and cold storage, and other essential elements to modern fishing operation. So when the UN Security Council imposed the ban on seafood-related exports to North Korea in 2017, this had a huge impact both on hard currency earnings, but on the people as well. If you look at the industry itself, according to North Korea's 2008 census, there were approximately 178,000 fishery workers. And according to Korea Maritime Institute's estimates, there are approximately 90,000 people in the aquaculture hubs under the Ministry of Fisheries Cooperative Union. So these people's livelihoods now stand in jeopardy due to decreased demand in markets and an inadequate domestic infrastructure to really grow domestic sales and consumption. Furthermore, North Korea's seafood was its third largest export in 2017. To China alone that year, it earned about $162.8 million, despite no official figures being reported after September. So obviously, one of the ways North Korea is trying to offset this decrease in exports is selling the fishing rights to Chinese fishermen and increasing the sale of fishing rights to Chinese fishermen. So while this is still a sanctioned activity under UN Security Council resolutions from 2017 on, the nature of the transaction is hard to track or prove, and there seems to be no shortage of Chinese companies willing to take the risk of getting caught. So our research found for the article that Sally and I wrote in The Diplomat that there were Chinese companies, as she mentioned, openly advertising on Weibo the sale of fishing rights and fishing trips to North Korean waters, with seemingly no fear of prosecution for violating sanctions. This tracks with reported incidents in the UN Panel of Experts reports as well, where, for instance, a member state estimated that the revenue earned by North Korea from this activity was about $120 million in 2018. In that same report, a member state reported that a crew member indicated that the price of a fishing permit for 3 months was approximately 400,000 yuan, or roughly $58,000. So pulling all of these threads together, you have high demand from the government and presumably quotas placed on the fishing industry. You have coupled with a high incidence of Chinese fishing boats that are essentially overfishing in already somewhat overfished North Korean waters. And then, as Jae-yoon talked about, this forces North Korean fishermen, displaces these North Korean fishermen to try and meet their quotas elsewhere. And that's where you get these primitive wooden North Korean fishing boats, which lack modern tracking and signaling capabilities, are really unable to withstand the harsh conditions of the open seas. These little wooden boats traversing these treacherous waters, essentially risking their lives to fish in foreign waters to meet their quotas. You also have the second order effects as well of overfishing in North Korean waters, which then depletes fish, and especially the squid that Jae-yoon had talked about in South Korean and Japanese waters as well, causing real ecological imbalances in the region. So this isn't just a North Korea problem, it's a growing global problem. And certainly there's ample evidence that in the context of North Korea, both UN Security Council sanctions and China's own fishing laws are being violated. And there is an obligation to hold states accountable for these violations. As with other transnational, non-traditional security threats like infectious disease management, climate change, and nuclear security, high-level leadership is crucial to catalyzing change. UN member states have an obligation under the UN Charter to respect the sovereign equality of fellow members, as well as to accept and carry out the decisions of the UN Security Council and to hold each other accountable for their actions. And despite the threat of an almost certain veto by China, other Security Council members should also elevate recent events to the level of full debate in the UN Security Council to catalyze further actions to improve enforcement and traceability practices. Moreover, it's in the region's interest to resolve this issue in a way that creates incentives for all sides to both comply with international laws and norms, but also to cooperate on more efficient and effective fisheries management and transparency and development in the region. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I'm going to post one last link for everyone in the audience to that Diplomat article that you co-wrote with Sally. Thank you for those informative and interesting presentations. We'll go into the Q&A now, and I have a couple questions to start off with. First, Jenny, you talked about how gaining international cooperation is so important for tackling these non-traditional types of security threats, including fisheries resource management. How could North Korea be brought into fisheries management as a cooperative partner to ensure the sustainability of its own resources? And is there a path forward for cooperation even under sanctions?
Well, certainly it's harder to do because of the sanctions regime, but there's a lot of assistance that North Korea actually needs, and that international organizations could start laying the groundwork for, including such things as best practices in fishery, modern fisheries management. I think there actually used to be some technological exchanges in the fisheries industries, even with US organizations prior to 2008 or so, which CRDF used to run. But there's also learning about the laws, creating types of regulatory systems that would better manage these. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on creating accountability for both domestic and foreign fishing practices. And that could mimic laws, for instance, in South Korea. And South Korea has some of these laws in place. So there's a lot of room for inter-Korean cooperation if they could ever get that on track, both in the fisheries management itself and helping modernize North Korea's fishing practices, but also in creating the kinds of legal and regulatory structures that would better manage the system as a whole. And there's a lot of work that can be done in the meantime from international organizations like FAO and other UN bodies to help create, to help pass on these practices and promote such things as data sharing, as Jae-yoon was talking about.
Thank you. We have some questions for Jae-yoon actually from the audience. Can AI methods help more automatically differentiate between illegal versus underreported and unregulated fishing? And also, is it possible to track individual ships using these techniques, either by researchers or Coast Guard authorities?
Yes, for the second question, due to the nature of these dark vessels that don't appear to public monitoring system, it's not really easy to track all these individual vessels. But some of them occasionally use AI signals sometimes that we were able to trace some of them, their activities and their movements back and from Chinese ports. So yes, if they broadcast some of the messages, we can trace some of the individual vessels. And for the first question, yes, that's really challenging to identify IUU fishing only using satellite technology. Sometimes it's more complicated. IUU is more complicated than just detecting vessels. So that's why we need also cooperation with the local authorities and the people who have this knowledge about all these details that cannot be detected by satellite observation. So we are open to any types of collaboration for this effort.
Thank you. I think the next question might be for Sally and Jae-yoon both. How many boats worldwide are involved in IUU fishing, and is China the largest offender? But also, how has IUU fishing impacted the rural livelihood in North Korea and North Korea's economy more broadly? So Jenny might also be able to comment.
So I can start with that. first off, just to build on what Jayon said, is just because vessels are fishing, we don't know necessarily if they're illegally fishing or engaging in IUU. And that's why surveillance is a huge part of understanding what is going on. But then we also need enforcement and prosecution and really monitoring when vessels come to offload, catch wherever it is. And that's why I talked about the transparency and traceability of seafood. That said, China accounts for about 40% of fishing vessels globally. Now, again, we don't know if you can't say just because they have the largest fleet, all of those vessels are engaged in IUU. And so in some estimates, like with the UN FAO, it's estimated to be about 3,000 to 4,000 vessels. In a recent report, it was estimated to be about 17,000 vessels. Obviously, a huge discrepancy of the number of Chinese fishing vessels. However, that takes into account the point I raised earlier, where China doesn't consider vessels fishing in neighboring countries to be distant water, even if they're fishing in what other countries consider their own EEZ, whether China does or not. So there is a large discrepancy, but whether it's 3,000, 4,000, or 10,000, the point is we need transparency across the whole system to understand what is going on. And without that, we're not going to really be able to get a true toehold into what is happening.
Yeah, to add that quite quickly, I think Sally mostly covered all these questions, but so Global Fishing Watch tracks about 70,000 industrial fishing vessels around the world that broadcast AIS messages quite often, but it's a very small fraction of all these industrial vessels around the world, and because of this presence of dark vessels or the nature of this obscure fisheries arena, it's really difficult to get down to the particular number of IUU fishing vessels by flag states. So that's also why we need this transparency by countries, open up their fisheries vessel monitoring system data, and also encourage more vessels to use AIS to be able to see these vessels' activities.
Do you see any change in the fishing rights transfer and operation of Chinese ships in North Korean waters in 2020 during the fishing season so far?
Well, we extended our study to 2019 and also 2020 up to, well, most of more or less now. And fishing continued in 2019. We detected about 800 vessels originating from China in 2019, fishing in North Korean waters. The total number that we detected and the estimated catch are at a comparable level to the previous years. For 2020, it's still too early to compare the level of activity, but we have already detected over 600 vessels as of May, June this year. It remains to be seen whether this fishing continues to the end of this year and the end of this season, or whether COVID pandemic has affected the fishing pattern. We'll continue to monitor, so please stay tuned in Global Fishing Watch.
Thank you. Jenny, a question for you, just an easy question. Given that sanctions are not working, what is the alternative? Is there an alternative?
The age-old question. I think you have to, one, define what you mean by working. So obviously, the laws are there. It has imposed some costs on the North Koreans. It has made it more difficult for them to do business, but it hasn't obviously stopped them from doing business, and it hasn't stopped countries from working with them. Again, this is an area where it requires leadership and accountability. If the Chinese fishing industry doesn't feel, if it's not worried about prosecution from the Chinese government, for instance, for violating sanctions, it will continue to do these transactions because it's lucrative for them to do so. And the same with the North Koreans. So, at some point, the Chinese government has created a number of laws to help increase transparency and to increase accountability, but they also have to enforce those laws on their own people and their own companies. And other countries need to hold countries, the UN member states especially, accountable for the transactions that they do, and especially when there is so much evidence of these violations that go on. But other than that, I mean, I think there is, big questions as to why, what is the rationale for keeping these sanctions on North Korea, especially in the seafood industry, where it does have an impact on the livelihoods of North Korean people and the food provision on North Korean people. This is a scenario where, as Jae-yoon had talked about in the past, there was greater accountability on the sale of fishing rights and greater restrictions on the sale of fishing rights when they were able to export as well and do legal trade and business. So I think, again, this overfishing now in the waters is a product of, this is the type of sanctions that are very hard to enforce, very hard to trace. It's not captured by, trade statistics itself because it's company to company transactions, and the money is still going to, a lot of military entities, for instance, in North Korea. So you run this sort of quandary of what's really the effectiveness of this, and is it doing more harm than good in that process? And and really need to reconsider what your strategy is on imposing that type of sanction.
Thank you, Jenny. We received a more technical question. Could someone talk more about how the vessels get stores to stay longer at sea? This might especially apply to the North Korean fishing boats that sail farther out now that there is more influx of foreign vessels in North Korea's waters.
Well, when it comes to vessels, the industrial vessels we detected in North Korean waters, we, based on the number of vessels that broadcast this AI system so that we could trace their movements, they made several trips to North Korean waters in a year. It's not just one trip to stay there for a month, but sometimes it's like 3 weeks. It could be just 1 month and a half, and then they go back to ports, and then they come back to the North Korean fishing ground in the same year. So we've seen a couple of vessels that made up to 4 trips in a year. So they made a lot of trips going back and forth.
If I could just add to that, I mean, and I think Jenny could illuminate a little more, whether it's vessels staying at sea, whether it's in North Korea or around the world. I mean, often fishing vessels stay at sea for years, and they have support vessels that provide them with oil and food and offload their catch. Those are called transshipment or service vessels. So that's how these vessels are able to operate globally for years at a time. And in addition, they have labor on board, which is often forced labor is the case. For example, in the State Department's trafficking in persons or forced labor, they really talk about how these fisher folks are on board literally for years, unknowingly at the beginning, understanding what they're getting themselves into. So that's a whole nother issue. And then another point just I want to raise about oil and oil bunkering in the area, and this is Jenny can elaborate a bit more, is fishing vessels are often used to conceal actual oil or gas being shipped to and from North Korea and waters around there, whether it's from Russia or China or whatnot. And so that's just another illegal activity where fishing vessels are being used, not just for fishing, but they change the compartments in the vessels to literally conceal another illegal activity. I don't know, Jenny, if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, the North Koreans are highly inventive when it comes to evading sanctions and getting the materials that they need. Using fishing vessels in this way has been used, but again, in a limited capacity. So, you know, as we noted before, there's really only about 1,500 of these motorized boats anyway. And part of the problem has been a lot of the fishing boats that go out for the original question go out into foreign waters, don't actually make it back. And this is what, you know, this whole prevalence of ghost boats washing up on shores has been about, is that they haven't been able to withstand the conditions or get the supplies that they need in order to stay out for to fish at distant waters that they've been trying to.
Jenny, we have a question in terms of the range of economic issues facing North Korea. Where would you rank the importance of IUU fishing, either for evading sanctions or for just an avenue for augmenting the coastal economies? Is this a central issue or a peripheral one?
Good question. I think it is of high importance given to the North Koreans, given how high a priority they've placed on the fishing industry. But in terms of the sanctions regime, I think it still has high importance in the sanctions regime as well, because obviously this is a big hole in the sanctions implementation sector, right? So you have one of the highest export, you know, on the seafood, because again, they weren't able to export seafood. They're still gaining hard currency from the sale of fishing rights. They've just increased, they've shifted their focus from the actual export of seafood, which is easier to track, to the sale of fishing rights, which provides them ways to evade sanctions, and again, and very willing partners given the lucrative nature of this practice. So I think it is a high priority issue to deal with, because it also has second order effects in the region, to, you know, South Korean, Japanese fishing industries as well, and can create, you know, like I said, huge ecological imbalance in the region in the long run if it continues along this pattern. So, you know, it might not be the most obvious area that, you know, when we talk about North Korea as to areas to focus on, but it certainly is of growing importance given the information that we have now about how large a scale the problem actually is.
Thank you. For Jae-yoon and Sally, a two-part question. Which technologies do you expect or foresee to be available in 10 years to control IUU? And what policies are needed today to help reach that point, combat this problem?
Very interesting, but very difficult question to answer. So I would say that anything that could happen in 10 years, like 10 years ago, if I look back 10 years ago, global fishing was not there. I mean, it was not even imaginable to detect all these vessels and monitor these fishing activities around the world, far away in the Pacific Ocean, you know, through your laptop. Like 10 years from now on, you know, you can imagine anything that could happen. I wouldn't really limit your imagination, but just let's imagine that what could happen. But I really believe that we should eliminate already IUU fishing, but well, before we reach that 10 years from now on.
As far as policies goes, I mean, you know, I have talked about transparency, but let me just talk about why it's important. I mean, you know, I think some new policies really go into effect is, for example, vessels shouldn't be able to get insurance if they're not willing to be transparent. They shouldn't be able to get access to global fishing, to the global seafood markets if they're not willing to be transparent. I mean, so often vessels are robbing coastal states of their resources, and those coastal states just do not have the capacity to monitor and enforce against foreign fishing. And so it's an economic issue, it's an environmental issue, and it's a general food and security issue. So I think it's just really important that globally countries stand up for this transparency point. And so often we hear about what's called joint ventures between, say, for example, China and some of the West African countries. Like in Ghana, for example, it is illegal for foreign vessels to fish in their EEZs. However, there are Chinese vessels with Chinese captains and Chinese crew who, once they come into the waters of Ghana, their flag changes from China to Ghana, Ghanaian, excuse me, and suddenly, you know, they're legal. So these sort of joint venture type agreements, we just need to understand who owns these vessels, what are the financial institutions that are setting them up, and really shine a light and understand the transparency behind the whole seafood supply chain before it's too late and there's no seafood left.
Those are great points, Sally. We have a question. What is the US government doing to address Chinese IUU fishing in the North Korean waters? Is the US government doing anything? Is there a role for the US government to play in encouraging China to increase its seafood traceability or some of the other measures that you spoke about?
Well, as I noted, just last week, the US Coast Guard announced a new IUU strategy. And they are they have what's called ship rider agreements. That's where, US officials get permission to board foreign vessel, go on tours with foreign enforcement and do training and whatnot. And similarly, and that's in and around Asian waters. I know the US Department of Defense, the Navy, is stepping up and wanting to do more related to IUU fishing. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as Jae-yoon showed, is doing more on monitoring, say with their VIA capacity of night lights. And then there's just more information sharing that I think our government is trying to do with other governments about IUU fishing. Again, there is surveillance, but we have to do more about enforcement, and we have to hold the feet to the fire on illegal fishing and just understand the difference between, fishing is not necessarily an illegal activity, but we need to understand when it is and how it is and do more about that. And I think our government, this is the interesting thing about fishing, IUU fishing, is it's a bipartisan issue. And it's a bipartisan issue because illegal fishing around the world hurts honest fishermen, whether they're in the United States or elsewhere. And so that's the reason our government is stepping up and working with the EU and working with Japan and working with Chile and other countries around the world to really get a grasp on this.
Pam, if I could just jump into it, I don't know that there's any specific actions being considered right now, again, for the specific Chinese fishing in North Korean waters, but I would suspect after this report, which again exposed the scale of this problem, that there are considerations being made for such things as secondary sanctions on Chinese companies, and especially those that are openly advertising North Korean fishing tours and the sale of North Korean fishing rights to Chinese companies. Again, this is one of those issues where when we found it online, just openly on one of the Chinese social media platforms, it was just so brazen of, here is something that is openly sanctioned in 2 different UN Security Councils, explicitly spelled out, and here's Chinese companies openly advertising that they're doing this activity and that they're promoting this activity without any sort of concern of any legal repercussions for doing so. And I think given that type of attitude, if the Chinese government isn't addressing it and showing leadership on this and imposing their own laws on their own companies, this is an area ripe for secondary sanctions.
We did have another question that I think dovetails nicely. Where else on the planet are we likely to see other dark fleets like the ones we've discussed in North Korea today?
Unfortunately, many places still we can see dark vessels, whether it be West African coast, East African coast, or in the Somalian waters or Southern Ocean. I think it's really prevalent still, and we need to, well, countries need to agree and have this more proactive actions in place to bring really light to the light this vessels activities in the high seas or in the EEZs, so that this presence of dark fishing fleets wouldn't really obscure all these fishing activities by authorized and legal fishers. So Global Fishing Watch and other partners tried hard to bring light to this illegal dark fishing fleets presence.
Thank you, Jae-yoon. We also received a question on the KPA. So this question notes that the sale of fishing licenses is clearly a lucrative business. So to what extent do the lower level authorities in North Korea's coastal areas benefit from the sale of fishing rights?
I'm not sure we necessarily have that information. Certainly there are a number of the fishing companies, North Korean fishing companies that are owned by KPA. And the company that we found in China that was advertising the sale of fishing rights, it did openly advertise it was purchasing the fishing rights from the KPA or from a KPA entity. And so, how that trickles down, there's certainly different levels of management. For instance, for the fishing units that are owned or governed by the party, there's both the central party and then provincial parties that have fishing companies. And on the KPA side, there's different units that have fishing companies as well. It has been known in the past to be a huge rent-seeking industry. But at this point in time, I don't think we have the transparency to really know how that trickles down in this kind of arrangement.
So we have just about 5 minutes left. I'm going to combine actually one of my questions with a question. We received a question about whether there's any plan to present the Global Fishing Watch findings to the Chinese government. And I would also like to ask, given the importance of China's cooperation in altering the pattern of IUU fishing, what would be the most important steps for the Chinese government to take to enforce its own rules, improve accountability?
Yeah, so we have been trying to collaborate with Chinese authorities in terms of supporting their monitoring efforts. I believe China has their own department that oversee their fishing vessels activities, but the presence of dark fishing vessels, presence of vessels that do not comply with their own regulations, we are here to provide technical support to not only Chinese governments, but all other governments around the world to technically support this monitoring, increase the monitoring capability and efforts to track their vessels and bring them to the compliance arena. So we haven't heard or received any official response from the Chinese authorities about this collaboration, research collaboration or others, but we still waiting for their response for our offer to help and collaborate. And transparency is really the top priority for any countries, including China, to ensure that fisheries are managed sustainably or transparently. So open up and share data and information with others publicly, so that demonstrate their commitment to transparency and sustainable management of fisheries.
Sorry. Yeah. So, as I said earlier, on the books, China is really starting to include new rules and regulations on both their domestic and international fleet. And that's very good news. What they need to do is really enforce these rules and regulations. So whether it's the AIS VMS that is such an issue, obviously, in the North Korean waters, or, they've said they plan to support and sign the Port State Measures Agreement before the year is out. We've got a quarter of the year left. Hopefully that'll happen. In their greening of the Belt and Road Initiative, they're talking about now including ocean activities in that. They've been talking about, there's been some consideration, but they have to do way more on ending subsidies. I mean, they subsidize their distant water fleets more than any other country in the world. And that really has to end. Yeah, so I think, again, it's back to the transparency. Who owns these vessels? What are the agreements all about? And once we really start to open up the system, then I think you'll see fisheries more sustainable around the globe and more equity throughout the whole system.
Thank you. Jenny, did you have any last comments as well? We'll have to end in a moment.
I think, Sally and Jaeyoon have already kind of given the broad strokes. I think there are efforts now as sort of a test of the Chinese government and what they're willing to do to comply with their own laws, as well as the UN Security Council, to go after the low-hanging fruit, which is the companies that have been identified already as violating sanctions, and openly, blatantly, brazenly violating sanctions and dealing and buying rights and fishing in North Korean waters. So I think this will be a good test to see how China reacts, if they are willing to take a leadership role on this issue, and if they are willing to promote, the rule of law throughout their practices, not just on books.
Well, thank you so much, all three of you, for joining me today for this really fascinating discussion. You've discussed the importance of building international cooperation, of using international organizations to implement policies that can help to combat the problem of IUU fishing. And this new study shows the importance of technology, creative technology use to provide data and really shine an even brighter light on the scale of the problem and give us insight into what we can do best to solve the issue in the future, hopefully before the next 10 years. Thank you as well to all of our audience members. I hope that you'll find the reports that I posted in the chat to be informative and helpful. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our panelists and ask them anything. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.